To touch the royal heirs was to invite a swift trip to the gallows. Even knowing the risks, she offered only a warm embrace when a pair of shivering, golden-eyed wolf pups sought refuge beneath her thin wool blanket. She had no idea their father, the ruthless Alpha King, was already stalking the castle corridors, following his children's scent straight to her door. Historical records from the winter of 1438 describe the high keep of Ethelgard as a fortress of mourning. The stone walls were perpetually draped in black banners, and a suffocating grief choked the life out of the courtyard. It had been barely 3 months since Queen Rosalind of the Ironfang pack was brutally ambushed by rogues in the Whispering Woods. Her death did not just break the heart of the Alpha King, Gideon. It shattered the fragile stability of the entire northern territory. But more tragically, it left his twin sons, Arthur and Zio, completely motherless at the tender age of 4. In werewolf society, a pup's early years are defined by the warmth and scent of their mother. Without her, the twins' grief manifested in terrifying ways. They lost the ability to control their shifts, remaining locked in their half-wolf, half-pup forms, small, feral things with golden eyes, razor-sharp milk teeth, and a desperate, inconsolable sorrow. They refused to eat. They bit the royal nurses, and their night terrors echoed through the stone corridors, chilling the blood of every guard on duty. Far below the royal nursery, in the damp, smoke-stained bowels of the keep, lived Maeve. Maeve was a scullery maid, an orphan from the bordering human village of Oakhaven. At 19, her life was defined by the harsh rhythm of scrubbing cast-iron pots, hauling boiling water, and enduring the sharp wooden spoon of Mrs. Gable, the keep's tyrannical head cook. Maeve existed at the very bottom of the keep's hierarchy. In a castle ruled by apex predators, a human servant without family or standing was practically invisible. She slept on a lumpy straw mattress in a cramped alcove just behind the great kitchen hearth, her only possessions a tattered woolen shawl and a small, crumbling block of cheap lavender soap she had bought from a traveling merchant. It was a Tuesday night in late November when the established order of Ethelgard was quietly, irrevocably broken. A brutal snowstorm was howling outside, rattling the iron-wrought windows of the kitchen. Maeve had just collapsed onto her straw mattress, her hands blistered and bleeding from scrubbing the banquet hall's stone floors with lye. The fire in the hearth had burned down to glowing embers, casting long, dancing shadows across the brick walls. A soft, desperate scratching sound woke her. Maeve froze, her breath catching in her throat. Rats were common in the scullery, but this sound was heavier. The scratching was accompanied by a pathetic, high-pitched whimper that sounded entirely too human. Slowly, Maeve pushed herself up, clutching her thin blanket to her chest. Peering over the edge of her mattress into the dim light, she saw them. 2 small, furry shapes were huddled together on the freezing flagstones. They were no bigger than medium-sized hounds, their fur a mix of dark charcoal and tawny gold. But these were no ordinary dogs. Their limbs were slightly elongated, their paws massive, and as one of them lifted its head, Maeve stared directly into a pair of startling, glowing amber eyes. They were the royal heirs. The Alpha King's pups. Panic seized Maeve's chest like an iron vice. The laws of the Ironfang pack were absolute, written in blood and enforced by execution. A human servant was forbidden from making direct eye contact with the royal family, let alone touching the heirs. If the royal guards found the princes in the filthy scullery, covered in soot, They would assume Maeve had lured them there. She would be hanged from the courtyard gates before dawn. "Go!" she whispered frantically, waving her hand. "You cannot be here. Shoo! Go back upstairs." The pups didn't move. The smaller of the two, Zio, though Maeve didn't know his name at the time, let out a heart-breaking whine and took a trembling step toward her. He was shivering violently, his small body racked with tremors, his ears pinned flat against his skull. The larger pup, Arthur, stood protectively in front of his brother, bearing tiny fangs, but his back legs were shaking just as badly. They looked starved. They looked terrified. But mostly, they looked incredibly, devastatingly cold. Maeve looked at the heavy iron door leading up to the servants' stairwell. She should run. She should alert the guards, scream for Mrs. Gable, do anything to save her own skin. But as Zio let out another weak, rattling breath and collapsed onto the cold stone, tucking his nose under his tail, Maeve's heart shattered. "Gods preserve me," she breathed. Ignoring every survival instinct she possessed, Maeve slid off her mattress. She moved slowly, dropping to her knees so she wouldn't tower over them. Arthur growled, a surprisingly deep rumble for such a small creature, but Maeve didn't flinch. She reached behind her, grabbed her only warm possession, the heavy patched woolen shawl, and held it out. "It's cold out there, little lords," she whispered, her voice soft and steady. "I have no royal silk, but I have a fire." Arthur hesitated, his golden eyes locked on hers. He sniffed the air. Maeve smelled of wood smoke, lye, and the faint floral scent of cheap lavender soap. Whatever he found in her scent, it made the tension bleed out of his small frame. He nudged his brother. Slowly, cautiously, the two royal pups crept forward. Maeve spread the shawl over her lap, and to her absolute astonishment, they didn't just sit on it. They crawled directly into her lap, burrowing their cold noses into the folds of her coarse linen dress. Maeve held her breath as she carefully wrapped the thick wool around them. They were heavy, their thick fur surprisingly soft, despite the dirt matting it. Almost instantly, as the warmth of her body and the proximity to the hearth enveloped them, the violent shivering began to subside. Arthur rested his chin heavy on Maeve's knee, while Zio curled into a tight ball against her stomach. Within minutes, the frantic, panicked breathing of the traumatized pups slowed into the deep, even rhythm of sleep. Maeve sat frozen against the brick wall for hours, terrified to move. She knew she was holding a death sentence in her arms. Yet as she felt their small hearts beating against her, she couldn't bring herself to push them away. For the first time in months, the Alpha's sons were sleeping peacefully. Hours later, just before the first light of dawn crept through the high windows, the pups stirred. Arthur licked Maeve's soot-stained hand once, a rough sandpaper caress, before nudging his brother. Without a sound, the two pups slipped out of the scullery, disappearing up the dark stairwell before the rest of the keep awoke. Maeve thought it was a one-time miracle, a bizarre anomaly of a snowy night. But the very next night, the scratching at her door returned. By the third week of December, it had become a dangerous, unspoken ritual. Every night, well after midnight, the heavy iron latch of the scullery door would click open, and two wolf pups would trot into Maeve's alcove. They no longer hesitated. They would leap directly onto her straw mattress, curl into the curve of her body, and pull her woolen shawl over themselves with their teeth. Maeve began saving scraps of roasted meat from the kitchen's leftovers, hiding them in her apron. She would feed them by hand in the dark, watching as they devoured the food they stubbornly refused to eat for their royal nurses. She brushed the soot and dirt from their fur using a comb she'd carved from pine. She hummed old lullabies from Oakhaven, stroking the soft spots behind their ears until they fell into deep, unbroken slumbers. During the day, the keep remained a battlefield of political tension. King Gideon was fraying at the edges, barely holding his pack together. His beta, Lord Corvin, a massive, scarred werewolf who harbored a deep hatred for the human servants, was quietly consolidating power. Corvin argued that Gideon's grief was making him weak, and that the pup's feral state was proof the bloodline was failing. Maeve witnessed this tension firsthand. One afternoon, while carrying a heavy bucket of slop to the pig pens, she saw Lord Corvin in the courtyard. He was furiously berating a human stable boy for not saddling his horse fast enough. Corvin backhanded the boy so hard the child fell into the mud, his lip split. Maeve froze, clutching her bucket, her blood running cold. But before Corvin could strike the boy again, a loud, vicious snarl echoed across the stones. Arthur and Zio, in their half-wolf forms, had bolted out of the keep. Arthur placed himself directly between the towering beta and the weeping stable boy, snapping his jaws at Corvin's boots. Zio flanked his brother, his golden eyes flashing with a predatory intelligence that belied his young age. Corvin sneered, taking a step back. "Control your beasts, King Gideon!" he shouted toward the balcony above. Maeve looked up. Standing on the high balcony, looking down with an expression of pure, thunderous authority, was the Alpha King himself. Gideon was a terrifyingly handsome man, tall and broad-shouldered, with raven black hair and eyes like chipped ice. He didn't say a word to Corvin. He simply watched his sons defend the human servant. Then Arthur turned his head. Across the bustling, crowded courtyard, the royal pup's eyes locked entirely on Maeve. He didn't run to her. He was too smart for that. But his tail gave a singular, distinct wag. Gideon, observing from the balcony, did not miss the exchange. The Alpha King's eyes narrowed, his gaze tracking from his son directly to the soot-covered scullery maid, clutching a bucket by the pens. Maeve felt the weight of that icy stare pin her to the spot. She quickly bowed her head and practically ran back into the kitchens, her heart hammering against her ribs. That evening, the atmosphere in the Alpha's war room was suffocating. Gideon sat at the head of the heavy oak table, rubbing his temples. The reports from the borders were grim, but his mind was elsewhere. His sons were changing. For the past 3 weeks, the night terrors that had plagued the keep had completely ceased. The royal nurses reported that the boys were no longer in their beds when they checked before dawn, yet they always appeared by breakfast, well-rested, their coats unusually glossy, and their bellies seemingly full, despite refusing the royal meals. But what puzzled Gideon the most was their scent. A werewolf's nose does not lie. For days, Gideon had noticed a strange, foreign aroma clinging to his son's fur. Beneath their natural scent of pine and rain, there was a heavy coating of wood smoke, lye, and the distinct, unmistakable odor of cheap floral lavender. "They are finding comfort somewhere," Gideon murmured to himself, pacing his chambers after the war council had concluded. Or with someone. The thought ignited a fierce, protective growl deep in his chest. His enemies were everywhere. Lord Corvin's faction was growing bolder. If someone was secretly manipulating his children, trying to earn their trust in the dark of night, it was a profound security breach. He had to know who was touching his sons. That night, Gideon did not sleep. He waited until the castle fell into total silence. The grandfather clock in the hall struck 2. From the shadows of the royal nursery, Gideon watched as the heavy oak door creaked open. 2 small shadows slipped out, their claws clicking faintly against the stone. The Alpha King stepped out of his chambers and began to follow them. He didn't need to see them. He simply followed the trail of their scent. He tracked them past the grand staircases, through the armory, and down the winding, narrow steps that led into the servant quarters. The air grew thicker here, smelling of damp earth, stale bread, and heavy soot. Gideon's jaw clenched. Why would the royal heirs willingly descend into the squalor of the scullery? He followed them to a heavy iron door at the back of the great kitchens. It was slightly ajar. Gideon pushed the door open, the rusty hinges giving a low groan. The room beyond was cramped and freezing, lit only by the dying embers of the massive hearth. The Alpha King's eyes adjusted instantly to the dark. He stepped forward, his massive frame practically filling the small space, ready to tear apart whoever had lured his children here. But the sight before him made the breath stall in his lungs. Curled on a pitifully thin, lumpy straw mattress was a young woman. Her face was smudged with soot, her hair a messy cascade of dark waves. She was fast asleep, her breathing deep and even, and tucked securely against her, wrapped in a tattered woolen shawl, were the princes of Ethelgard. Arthur's head was resting squarely on the girl's chest, rising and falling with her breaths. Zio was curled under her chin, one of the girl's blistered, lye-burned hands resting protectively over the pup's flank. They looked incredibly small, perfectly safe, and undeniably happy. The heavy floral scent of lavender hit Gideon's nose, overpowering everything else. Gideon took a step closer, his boots scraping the stone. The sound was microscopic, but in the dead quiet of the scullery, it was enough. Maeve's eyes fluttered open. For a second, she was disoriented. Then she saw the massive silhouette of the Alpha King looming over her bed, his icy blue eyes glowing in the dark, staring down at her with an unreadable, intense expression. She was caught. Maeve's blood ran colder than the winter winds, howling against the keep's stone walls. She scrambled backward, hitting the brick of the hearth, instinctively pulling the heavy woolen shawl tighter around the pups. She expected a roar that would shake the soot from the ceiling. She expected the heavy steel of the king's broadsword to end her life before she could draw another breath. Instead, Gideon remained perfectly, terrifyingly still. Arthur woke first. Sensing the towering presence of another alpha, the young pup's hackles raised. He let out a sharp, defensive bark and scrambled out of the shawl, planting his small, furry body squarely between Maeve and the king. Zio woke a second later, blinking sleep from his amber eyes, and immediately pressed his back against Maeve's chest, baring his milk teeth at his own father. Gideon's icy blue eyes widened in profound shock. His own flesh and blood, the heirs to the Iron Fang pack, were treating him as a threat while fiercely guarding a human scullery maid. "Peace, little wolves," Gideon murmured, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that lacked its usual absolute authority. He slowly dropped to one knee, bringing himself eye-level with the mattress. He looked past his defensive sons and locked his gaze onto Maeve. "What is your name, girl?" Maeve, your grace," she stammered, her hands trembling violently. "Please, I swear upon the old gods I did not lure them down here. They were freezing. I only meant to warm them." "I know," Gideon replied softly. The admission stunned her into silence. He reached out a massive, calloused hand, letting Arthur sniff his knuckles before gently scratching the pup behind the ears. I have tracked their scent for days. You possess no magic, Maeve of the scullery, yet you have accomplished what my finest healers and royal nurses could not. You gave them peace. Maeve swallowed hard, too terrified to speak. Tomorrow, Gideon continued, rising to his full imposing height, you will not report to the kitchens. You will be moved to the east wing. You are to be the prince's sole warden. If head cook Gable or any other servant asks, you are acting under my direct, unquestionable command. It was an unprecedented elevation, one that sent shockwaves through the rigid hierarchy of Ethelgard. By noon the next day, Maeve was standing in a sunlit chamber, adorned with rich tapestries, bathed and dressed in fine, heavy wool gowns befitting a royal governess. But the sudden promotion placed a massive target on her back. Lord Corvan, the ruthless Beta, was furious. His entire strategy to usurp Gideon relied on the Alpha King appearing broken and his heirs remaining feral, unstable beasts. The sudden recovery of the royal pups, who were now eating heartily from Maeve's hands and laughing as they chased each other through the corridors, was destroying Corvan's political leverage. Corvan summoned his closest ally, Viscount Reginald Hastings, a wealthy and corrupt northern lord who controlled the pack's grain supply. They met in the damp cellars beneath the armory, surrounded by casks of aging ale. "The king is blinded by a peasant," Corvan sneered, pacing the stone floor. "She hums a few tavern songs, feeds them scraps, and suddenly Gideon thinks the bloodline is saved. The council is regaining faith in him." Viscount Hastings adjusted his fur-lined cloak, his eyes glittering with malice. "Then we remove the peasant, and the pups with her. It must look like an accident, or better yet, a tragedy born of human treachery. If the maid poisons them, Gideon will not only lose his heirs, but his mind. The pack will demand you take the Alpha title to restore order." Corvan's scarred lips curled into a wicked smile. The winter solstice banquet was only 3 days away. It was a mandatory feast where King Gideon was expected to formally present his sons to the allied lords, proving the strength of his pack. "Procure the wolfsbane," Corvan whispered to Hastings. "A concentrated liquid. We will lace the boys' ceremonial meat. When they fall, I will ensure the vial is found in the scullery maid's chambers." For the next 3 days, Maeve lived in a state of hyper-vigilance. While the royal quarters were warm and luxurious, she could feel the daggers in the stares of the castle guards loyal to Corvan. She never left Arthur and Zio's side. She played with them, read them old human tales, and slowly, miraculously, coaxed them back into their human forms. When they finally shifted back into 2 dark-haired, golden-eyed boys, Gideon had wept, a silent, stoic shedding of tears behind closed doors that Maeve pretended not to see. But as the solstice banquet arrived, a heavy sense of dread settled in Maeve's gut. The great hall was a sea of velvet, iron, and candlelight. Lords and ladies from across the territory feasted at the long oak tables, their laughter echoing off the vaulted ceilings. Maeve stood dutifully in the shadows behind the high table, keeping a watchful eye on Arthur and Zio, who sat beside their father. When the main course, a massive platter of rare roasted venison, was brought forward, Lord Corvan himself carried the silver tray to the king's table. He bowed deeply, offering the first cuts to the young princes. "To the health and long life of the royal heirs," Corvan announced loudly, drawing a cheer from the hall. Maeve watched as Corvan set the silver plates before the boys. From her years in the suffocating heat of the scullery, working with hundreds of herbs, spices, and cleaning agents, Maeve possessed an incredibly sharp sense of smell. As the steam rose from the meat, cutting through the scent of rosemary and garlic, Maeve caught a faint, unmistakable odor. It smelled sweet, earthy, and metallic, like damp soil and crushed bitter almonds. Wolfsbane. Arthur reached for his silver fork, a hungry smile on his young face. "No!" Maeve screamed. The word tore from her throat before she could stop herself. Protocol, fear, and her station vanished. She lunged forward from the shadows, shoving past the armed guards, and sapped the heavy silver plates off the high table. The plates clattered violently against the stone floor, the tainted venison skittering across the flagstones. The great hall plunged into a dead, horrifying silence. The music stopped abruptly. Every werewolf in the room shot to their feet, their eyes flashing, low growls rumbling in their chests. A human servant had just physically assaulted the royal table. "Seize her!" Lord Corvin roared, his face twisting into a mask of faux outrage. "The human has lost her mind. She attacks the princes." Two massive guards lunged forward, grabbing Maeve by the arms and slamming her hard against the stone floor. Pain exploded in her shoulder, but she didn't care. She looked wildly at Gideon, who had leaped up from his throne. His jaw clenched, his eyes blazing with shock and fury. "My king, the meat!" Maeve gasped, struggling against the heavy boots pressing into her back. "Don't let them eat it. It's poisoned with wolfsbane. I smelled it." Viscount Hastings stepped forward, sneering. "A desperate lie from a deranged maid. Alpha, she clearly meant to humiliate your house, or worse, poison them herself and blame us. Search her." Corvin stepped heavily toward Maeve, drawing his dagger. "Treason is punished by death, human. You have overstepped your bounds for the last time." But before Corvin could bring the blade down, a terrifying dual snarl echoed through the hall. Arthur and Zio did not cower. They did not hide behind their father. In perfect unison, the 4-year-old boys shifted. Their human skin rippled, giving way to thick fur and heavy muscle. In seconds, 2 formidable, half-grown wolves stood over Maeve's pinned body. Arthur clamped his jaws onto the wrist of the guard, holding Maeve, biting down hard until the man screamed and dropped her. Zio snapped viciously at Corvin's boots, driving the towering beta back. The entire hall gasped. The pups were fighting with the tactical precision and fury of true alphas, defending a human. "Enough!" The word was a thunderclap. King Gideon vaulted over the high table, landing with a heavy thud between his sons and Corvin. The alpha aura radiating off Gideon was so suffocatingly powerful that several lesser lords in the hall were forced to their knees. Gideon did not look at Maeve. He walked slowly toward the spilled venison on the floor. He dropped to a crouch, closing his eyes, and inhaled deeply. Werewolf senses were sharper than a human's, but wolfsbane was uniquely designed to mask itself from wolf noses, blending with the blood of the meat. But Gideon concentrated, peeling back the layers of scent. Rosemary, salt, blood. And there it was, the faint, bitter sting of the deadly root. Gideon stood up. When he opened his eyes, they were entirely black, the mark of an alpha pushed to the absolute brink of lethal violence. He turned his gaze slowly toward Viscount Hastings, who was suddenly sweating profusely, and then to Lord Corvin. "You meant to murder my children in my own hall." Gideon's voice was a deadly, chilling whisper that carried to every corner of the room. "Alpha, no!" Corvin stammered, taking a panicked step backward. "The human lies. She laced it. She—" Corvin never finished his sentence. In a blur of sheer, predatory speed, Gideon crossed the distance. his hand wrapped around Corvin's throat, lifting the massive beta off his feet with terrifying ease. Corvin clawed frantically at Gideon's arm, but the king's grip was like iron. "You questioned my grief," Gideon snarled, his fangs extending. "You questioned my bloodline, but worst of all, you underestimated the loyalty of the one who saved them." With a sickening crunch, Gideon snapped the beta's neck. He tossed Corvin's lifeless body onto the floor like a discarded rag. Viscount Hastings shrieked, dropping to his knees and begging for mercy as the royal guards instantly dragged him away to the dungeons. The great hall was frozen in stunned, breathless terror. Slowly, Gideon's eyes returned to their icy blue. He turned away from the carnage and walked toward Maeve. The guards who had pinned her scrambled away, terrified. Arthur and Zio nudged her gently with their wet noses, whining softly until she managed to push herself up onto her knees, clutching her bruised shoulder. Gideon stopped in front of her. The towering, blood-soaked Alpha King dropped to one knee on the cold stone floor, bringing himself level with the former scullery maid. He reached out, ignoring the soot that still clung to the edges of her dress, and gently cupped her face. His thumb brushed a tear from her cheek. "You risked the gallows to warm them," Gideon said, his voice carrying clearly through the silent hall. "You risked the blade to save them. You possess no claws, Maeve of Oakhaven, yet you are the fiercest protector in this keep." Gideon stood, taking her hand and pulling her gently to her feet. He turned to face the stunned assembly of lords and ladies. "Hear me," Gideon's voice boomed. "The era of shadows in Ethelgard is over. This woman is no servant. She is the savior of the Ironfang pack. Anyone who disrespects her, anyone who questions her place at my side, will answer to my fangs." Maeve looked down at Arthur and Zio, who were sitting proudly at her feet, their tails wagging softly. She looked up at Gideon, seeing not just a king, but a man who had finally found the light in the darkness. She was no longer invisible. From the freezing depths of the scullery to the high table of the Alpha King, Maeve had proven that true strength wasn't about the sharpness of your teeth, but the size of your heart. Did Maeve's courage leave you breathless? Her journey from a forgotten scullery maid to the fiercely protective queen of the Ironfang pack proves that a warm heart can conquer the darkest of castles. If you loved this dramatic werewolf romance and want to uncover more thrilling, twist-filled stories of loyalty, betrayal, and unexpected love, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share this epic tale with your friends and subscribe to the channel for more incredible daily stories.